we looked at the song and the prayer of Hannah, and we talked about God reversing, didn't we? The human perspective and how he's going to shake things up, because the way that God looks at things and the way that you know, his particular insistence and desires and whatever is so contrary to the human experience. And so really that is our challenge in ecclesial life, isn't it? That we see things spiritually. Oh yeah, we're human beings. We walk in the door and we can bring the natural man. It's so easy for us to bring that with all its frustrations and, you know, the difficult times at home from, you know, before you came to the meeting, or the, you know, road rage, etc. All of those things, we can bring that through the door, and our, you know, problems with, you know, brother Phil or whatever it might be. We can bring those things, but that's just a natural man. And God is raising us above that. He's encouraging us to bring a spirit, his spirit, into the ecclesia. And so let him deal with the judgment issues in many ways. And I don't know, by that mean the ecclesia shouldn't make decisions. I'm not saying that at all. But the big picture, let God judge ultimately. And in that reversals we saw in the beautiful prayer, he talked about the violent and the mighty are going to be judged by God. And they're going to be brought low. And he also mentioned that the barren would become fertile. And what we've got in the first 2 chapters of 1 Samuel, if you'd like to read them all, we had chapter 1 read by Brother Peter, but if we just flowed through them, you'd see that there is this deliberate contrast of these 2 houses. So that's why our title is The Contrast of Legacies, of the house of Eli and the house of Elkanah. All right? Because the Bible does that. Let's just see it, all right? Verse 3 of chapter 1. Did you notice that as it being read? It says, and this man, talking about Elkanah, went up out of his city yearly to worship and to sacrifice unto Yahweh of hosts in Shiloh. And the 2 sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, the priests of Yahweh, were there. Now, why are they combined together? Because that's the start of this deliberate contrast between these 2 houses. And it's all the way through. Chapter 2, verse 11 and 12. It says, and Elkanah went to Ramah to his house. This is after the prayer song. And the child did minister unto Yahweh before Eli the priest. Now the sons of Eli were sons of Belial. They knew not Yahweh. Deliberate contrast, sitting side by side in the record here. What about verse 17 and 18 of this chapter? It says, wherefore the sin of the young men was very great before Yahweh, for men abhorred the offering of Yahweh. But Samuel ministered before Yahweh, being a child girded with a linen ephod. Again in verse 25 and 26. I don't want to keep on going because that, you know, I hope I've made the point. So as you read through that, you see the deliberate contrast. But what we've got, all right, we could, you know, I could sort of say to you now what we're going to do is going to look at the house of Eli, and we're going to absolutely condemn that, and then we're going to look at Elkanah, its family, and this is like they're perfect. That's not the point of this record. The point that we're looking at is the interaction between the 2. As I said this morning, sometimes we say it's a given, all right? And it's a given that Eli's boys were out of control. These were the priests, and they were doing the wrong things. Now, you know, I'm just going to pose some questions. They're quite rhetorical. You don't have to expect that Phil answers them all. Just think of this. They were of the house, as in Eli was, of what tribe? Of Levi. They were Levites, okay, in the Aaronic line. So what did the tribe of Levi stand for? Now, don't turn it up because I don't want you to lose the flow. But in Exodus chapter 32, God called Levi to himself, didn't he? In verses 26 to 28, For what did they stand that God endorsed this tribe as being special? Remember it? They stood aside, didn't they? They stood on God's side, didn't they? And what about? Well, in summary, it was about wrong belief and wrong practice, which was led into wrong behaviour. True? In a summary. So they stood for God when it came down to those important issues. So what have we got in this story? Both of those things there, the sons of Eli here, Hophni and Phinehas, are totally going against that, aren't they? They're no longer a people who stood for Yahweh. They're no longer a people who said, no, God wants this and we're going to do it this way. And our attitude, our motivation, and especially our behaviour there should be consistent with the holy God of Israel. So their behaviour was totally opposed to that of the tribe of Levi. And think about towards the end of the wilderness wandering, we had the example of Phinehas. Okay, not this guy, okay, but the son of Eleazar. And so what we've got there is he stood for something too. If we went across to Numbers chapter 25, if you're taking notes, write that down. Numbers 25 verses 11 to 13. What was that in relation to? He stood aside, didn't he? Again, it was an issue of belief, practice, behaviour, wasn't it? So on both of those occasions, one at the beginning and one at the end of the wilderness wanderings, God had praised. In fact, interestingly enough, Phinehas was given a covenant of peace for eternity for doing that. So here were things that they should have actually embraced as a family. God was holy, God was pure. Their behaviour, their actions should have been examples to the entire ecclesia. And yet things had gone wrong in this particular family. Remember what we said about judges. There was no king in Israel. Every man did that which was right in his own eyes. And this morning we sort of said, well, we can look at that negatively and we can look at it positively. And again, in tonight's study, we've got both of these things happening. We could read it either way. Because what we've got is Eli is doing things which was right in his own eyes. Now, I'll pause there. What do you know about Eli? Had problems with his eyes. So we've got a wonky look at life here in this sense. And that's contrasted by God deliberately in this record with Elkanah, who was also of the Levitical family. He wasn't in the line of the priests. He was a son of Kohath. He was a son of Korah, interestingly enough. And yet this family, stuck and abided in the things that the Levitical family and house had done so. Now, when we look at then with that kind of viewpoint, we start to see some unusual things, and I believe helpful and exhortational things. Like, for instance, chapter 1, verse 9. So Hannah rose up after they had eaten in Shiloh, and she hadn't eaten, nor had she had anything to drink, right? Now Eli, the priest, here's another one of those contrasts. So Hannah rises up and she goes into Shiloh to worship, to pray. Now Eli, the priest, sat upon a seat by the post of the temple of Yahweh. The word seat there in the Hebrew is the word kissa, and it means a throne. It's often translated that, a throne. Now, isn't that a little unusual? He's a priest, the high priest, and he's sitting on a throne. And notice also that it's called what at the end there? Sitting by the post of the temple. Wait, the temple? Surely he means the tabernacle. And yet that word, temple, is the correct word that you would use for a palace or a temple. So it would seem, you'd put this all together, it would seem that what's happened is that the tabernacle had rested, which is the name for Shiloh, in this particular place, and maybe over time, or maybe just under the guidance of Eli the high priest, they in fact added to it. And there's got other buildings around. In fact, it's established. Now, what's wrong with that? That they would have added extra rooms. What would be wrong with that if they added extra rooms? Maybe in a room that, for instance, Samuel, laid down in chapter 3, went to sleep. Eli obviously lived there. Is there anything wrong with that? You go, well, yes and no, when you think of it, right? God didn't seem to give any instructions in regard to that. But the tabernacle was supposed to be a temporary building, wasn't it? And God had said in Deuteronomy chapter 12 that eventually he was going to establish a place. And this is where David's mind came to it. The temple was going to have to be built in Jerusalem. But here's Eli the high priest establishing a temple, a permanent resting place in Shiloh. So in many ways, you might go, there's nothing against it per se, but just think about it. Was there anything right about what he's doing there? And he's got a throne there, which he sits upon. So I pose the question, is Eli just lost the plot a little bit, and he's just lost his way, and he's losing sight of exactly what his position and role was? Yes, he was judge. Yes, he was the high priest. But was he doing other things? And this was sort of mixing up. Chapter 2, verse 12, it says, the sons of Eli were sons of Belial. They knew not Yahweh. And yet if we went across to Malachi chapter 2 and read from verses 1 to 9, and we won't do that for time, but if you did that, you would read all about the priests. And it actually reflects upon Phinehas. And it talks about the covenant of peace that God gave to Phinehas. Why? Because the priest's lips should keep knowledge. So the priest, of course, stood as the mediator of God and the nation. And they were supposed to represent God to the people. And they were supposed to have God's word on their lips, but then they had to, of course, practice that in their life. So here were men that didn't even know Yahweh. So how could the knowledge of God be there if they didn't know him? And we learned already, because we read it in verse 17 of chapter 2 there, that the behavior was so poor, so abominable in God's sight. It says, wherefore the sin of the young men was very great before Yahweh, for men abhorred the offering of Yahweh. So much, really, when you think of it, so bad were they that rather than drawing people to learn about God, not only from their lips, but by their behavior, by the example that they gave, they actually drove people away. Quite a sad situation. And I say that very sad. And I think Eli was sad about that too. We find in verse 22 of chapter 2 there it says, now Eli was very old, and heard all that his sons did unto all Israel, and how they lay with the women that assembled at the door of the tabernacle of the congregation. And so he says to them, why do you such things? But we know from the story that they didn't listen to their father when he, in a sense, gently rebuked them for their behaviour. And it's true here that Eli was also caught up, and he disapproved of this behaviour, but we find that he doesn't say anything about what they did about the sacrifices. So that when people came up to sacrifice to God, and his sons, Hophni and Phinehas, and the servants of his sons, came and stole the sacrifices, which were supposed to be to God, and also shared in the peace offering with the people, the offerers themselves. And when they stole that, Eli said nothing about that. Now, we know that he was a very fat man. So he enjoyed, sadly, the stolen meat, which was shared with him by the behaviour of his sons. Now, over lunch, I was saying that I liked to actually look at Bible characters not as 2D cartoons, but as 3D, and Wilby rather sort of like, with a great deal of wit said, oh, well, Eli was more 5D. I did appreciate that, so I said I'd share it with you. It's quite incredible, isn't it, that we have this kind of situation. But I want to pose something to you, and I really want you to think about this. And that is, it's so easy for us when we're reading the Bible record to only see things in 2D. All right, and Eli here, I think, in many ways, was a man who wanted things to be different. He knew what his calling was. I don't think he was ignorant of the law, and I don't think at times that he, looked at life, and I think he very much wished it was different, as I just said. His sons were the sons of Belial. And sadly, I think that through these rather dim, jaundiced eyes of his, he started to look at everybody in a different way. And we can do that too, brothers and sisters and young people. We can come to the meeting and we can find faults. It's so easy because we're all human. It would be far preferable, wouldn't it, to actually come to the meetings to see God alive and working in the lives of our brothers and sisters. And I think that of all of Eli's sort of complex life here, where he was the judge, where he wanted to do right things, but he found at times that he couldn't. And when he speaks up to his sons, they don't listen to him. And there's fault here, brothers and sisters, without a doubt. We're not going to go into what the man of God actually says to him at the end of chapter 2. But God condemns the behaviour and says that because the boys were out of control, he was going to take the priesthood away from the house of Ithamar that Eli was in fact a descendant of. And he was going to give it across. And that didn't happen for a long, long time. In fact, he didn't even bring judgment down on the house of Eli for at least another 20 years. The reason why I mention that is because I keep on wanting to highlight the character of God. God wants people to change. And I think that he deep down wanted Eli to change through the influence of Samuel. Now, that's a bold statement, isn't it? Because what we're now going to do is now look at some of these words from the flip side, from the house of Elkanah. Because although it's called that his sons were sons of Belial, we find therefore that he saw everybody that came up to the area of Shiloh. Probably he saw them in this kind of way. Notice we'll go back to our reading and we look in in verse 12. Hannah has made her prayer and only her lips moved. So verse 12 says, and it came to pass as she continued praying before Yahweh that Eli marked her mouth. Now Hannah, she spake in her heart, only her lips moved, but her voice was not heard. Therefore Eli thought that she had been drunken. You might ask yourself the question, how many drunken women had he seen at Shiloh? And the answer probably was lots. Now, if he had dim eyes, he wouldn't be able to see all that well, true? So where was Hannah, probably kneeling, when she prayed this prayer? Where would she have been? Right there. For him to see her lips move, it's not a particularly great body movement, is it? Okay? I'm just... Can you see it at the back? Can you see me moving my lips? Oh, Matthew, you've got excellent eyesight. Should have asked somebody else. It's hard, isn't it? So what I'm saying is for him to have noticed that, she had to be right there. And we made the point in this morning about the environment. And so I want you to get this idea, because I think sometimes it becomes a little bit unreal for us, that in this situation, he's sitting on the throne, he's watching things come and go, he's not happy about things. And here comes this woman right beside him, who utters this prayer, and he draws the wrong conclusion. Notice what she says. Verse 16. Count not thine handmaid for a daughter of Belial. For out of the abundance of my complaint and grief have I spoken hitherto. Now, his sons were sons of Belial. She says, don't count me like one of them. But there's another little expression in there that also I want to draw upon, because I believe, brothers and sisters, that Eli was touched and assisted by the example of Elkanah and his family and Samuel, who he raised. So let's look what she says there. Verse 16 again, count not thine handmaid for a daughter of Belial. Now, brothers and sisters, would we have been so quick to show respect and honour to this man in that environment? I wonder whether we would. Which does bring out, of course, I think, a powerful example to us, doesn't it? About the way we interact with each other. He was the Lord's anointed. And Elkanah and Hannah came up with the family, with Peninnah and the children, came up every year, we read that, with their sacrifice, with their offering, to worship before Yahweh, to do the right thing. And there, right in their face, was an environment which was ungodly and corrupt. And yet she calls him, I'm your handmaid. And all the way through, you could just read it and you find he says, I'm your handmaid. She says that she's the handmaid of the Lord. She's the handmaid of Eli. She calls him my Lord. So here is this respect. Again, here's a bit of an exhortation for us all, right? Our ecclesias are undergoing a great deal of stress at the moment, and they're being pulled in a whole range of different ways, all right? I beg of you to demonstrate this quality in your ecclesia, and that is to show respect for one another. There will be differences of opinion, and there will be people undergoing a great deal of stress, and they will see some things differently. What we need to do is to work with each other. And if this woman here could show respect to the Lord's anointed, then how could we not but show respect to our brothers and sisters of Christ for whom Christ died? Now that's straight from my heart, because I just feel that we need a good dose of that in our ecclesial world at the moment. And we need each other really badly. So if we need each other, we need to treat each other with that kind of godly respect. So I think, how would you feel if you were Eli at that particular moment? You've seen this family, Elkanah and Hannah, Peninnah and the children, coming up year by year in the middle. You're the high priest. You know things are going terribly wrong. And here is a faithful family who won't deviate from their own personal standing, because they believe that God is holy and righteous and loving and kind and deserved of every bit of attention that they can give. They don't stay away from the meeting in that sense. They are there trying to help. We notice here, if we look at verse 10 of this chapter, the intensity of Hannah when she comes there and she's sitting or kneeling or standing, we don't know exactly, next to Eli. Says she was in bitterness of soul and prayed unto Yahweh and wept sore. Just unpack that to start to see the intensity of this particular moment. She prayed and she wept sore. Brothers and sisters, she was there all the time. She was continual. It was extremely personal to her, because Elkanah's not there at this particular moment. She was undeterred. She was undistracted. Imagine what was going on around her. She was effectual and fervent in that prayer. She wasn't giving up, because she knew what her ecclesia needed. And of course, we mentioned this morning in verse 11, there was this personal commitment. She vowed a vow to herself, which then, of course, passed on to her son, this desire of a Nazarite. She was promising guidance, wasn't she? And as we mentioned this morning, she was praying for a deliverer. She didn't just want a baby. She wanted a man-child. She wanted a deliverer, a Messiah, a reformer. In verse 12 it says there, and it came to pass as she continued praying. Now, Eli is observing this. The word continued there means to increase. I don't know whether that was increase in intensity. I can almost imagine, sort of, this is my vivid imagination, but I can almost imagine great drops, like sweat, like blood pouring from her face. It got so intense, this personal thing with her. Now, don't write that down in your notes. It's not right. I'm just saying that it meant so much to her, right? Because it was before Yahweh. Was it increased in length? Was it increased in number? Was she there regularly? Did she leave and then go and come back? We're not told exactly, but Eli is watching this and noting all of this. We've already mentioned that, she calls him the handmaid. So you look at verse 16, all right, is the mention there, okay? But she also honours God in all of this. Verse 15, I have poured out my soul unto Yahweh. And again, as I say, Eli is hearing this. He had observed it, now he's hearing it. It all now makes sense of what this woman is all about. Now, it's also worthy of note, something I might disagree with my father-in-law on. I won't tell him that. So you're all, I've entered into a secret there with you. I don't know whether in verse 13, whether when it says that she spake in her heart, only her lips moved. I know it's been purported that if you go back to a vow uttered by a wife, that if the husband hears it, that he could then sort of say, no, I don't agree with that, and she wouldn't be able to go forward with the vow. The way I read this text, brothers and sisters and young people, is I see Elkanah and Hannah as one in this. So there's no doubt that Elkanah was in an agreement with the dedication of Samuel to God. There's no way that he would retract that, so there was no need for her not to express it. I think it was just bubbling and boiling up in her. Maybe she didn't say it aloud because of the noise that was going around and the distraction. But I believe that they are one. You notice, if you want proof of that, well, verse 4, we find that they come up as a family. The whole family in chapter 1, verse 4, they're all together. In chapter 1, verse 5, we find that he loved Hannah. And I'm sure that Hannah would have been his only wife if she'd been able to bear seed. He was a Levite, sorry. That was based on heredity. So if Hannah had been able to have children, then perhaps there would have been no need for Peninnah to be taken as a wife. And I know some people see that Peninnah was a problem here, but in the Hebrew there is no neuter gender, so you have to say she or he. And so I don't read it as Peninnah being a problem here. I think the problem was that Hannah felt intense rejection of God because a Jewish woman that couldn't have children just cut to the core. And she wanted a Messiah at this particular time. And so in that sense, I think she felt, even just by Peninnah being there would have been, of course, a difficulty for her. And seeing children being born would also have heaped upon her. But she turns that inwardly to God. And we find that there is love and understanding. And they go up in verse 9, of course, to worship together. It's interesting, of course, that Elkanah tries to say the right thing. Okay, brothers, speaking directly to you, how many times have you thought you're going to help the situation and you've put your great fat foot in it? Okay, so he says to her in verse 8, am I not better than 10 sons? Probably that was the wrong thing to say. All right. Let's not condemn Elkanah for being like every one of us in that regard. So what we've got here, I believe, is this house of Elkanah. They are this faithful unit, and they are together worshipping. All right. And notice just perhaps another couple of points over in verse 23 of chapter 1. It says, and Elkanah her husband said unto her, Hannah, do what seemeth thee good, tarry until thou have weaned him, only Yahweh establish his word. So the woman abode and gave her son suck until she weaned him. See, there's no discordancy here in the family. Elkanah says to Hannah, I understand why you're not going up this year. And until you're ready to give him to God, until he's weaned, I agree with you. And here they're one in purpose, I see, brothers and sisters. And then in verse 24, we mentioned this briefly this morning. And when she had weaned him, she took him up with her with 3 bullocks and 1 ephah of flour and a bottle of wine, and brought him unto the house of Yahweh in Shiloh, and the child was young. And this was the time to give it up. And they bring 3 bullocks. Brothers and sisters, this is an incredible offering. They were giving a lot, because a bullock was a very, very important part of the flock. And Elkanah, they're giving the best, aren't they, to God? Now, some of you might have a different rendition there. Is anyone in the room that's got a different rendition of that particular verse in regard to the 3 bullocks? Yes, it's got a bullock of 3 years old. Yeah, exactly. Rubbish. No, I shouldn't have said that. I'm not a Hebrew expert, but I think that it's 3 bullocks. And you might go, why do I think that when I'm not an expert? And Rotherham obviously is, and the Septuagint, well, they almost are. Why would we do that? And go, well, it's interesting. It's because of the other. It says, and 1 ephah of flour. If you go back into the law, and I thank my father-in-law's wonderful book for this, but when you brought up a burnt offering of a bullock, you gave 1/3 of an ephah of flour. Okay, now when I went to school, okay, 3 times 1/3 equals 1. So what we've got here is 3 bullocks and 3 portions that went with that, plus the drink offering. It sort of sits well with the whole record of the law. And this is when they're going to come up. And as we posed this morning, did they really fulfill the vow at this point? And I propose to you they didn't, because Samuel's whole life for eternity was the vow. So it never finished. All right. But they come up here together. So here's Elkanah giving of the very best. It was a very rich sacrifice to God. And Hannah's there with him. But it is interesting, isn't it, that they don't have more children. Have you thought about that? They don't have any more children. So here's Hannah and Elkanah again appearing before Eli. And notice in verse 25 it says, and they slew a bullock and brought the child to Eli. I think where it says they slew a bullock, it's the bullock for Samuel's dedication. And she said, O my Lord, as thy soul liveth, my Lord. Again, the respect. I am the woman that stood by thee here, praying unto Yahweh. For this child I prayed, and Yahweh hath given me my petition, which I asked of him. And we gave you that slight better translation for verse 28 here, that God had been asked for this, and therefore the asking was a continual thing. Quite lovely in its framework here. But did you notice, and someone at lunchtime said, in fact it was Sarah, said to me, it says, and he worshipped Yahweh there. Who's the he? I'm sure I look up and I see a lot of people nodding their heads. They've thought about this before. All right. Who's the he? Is it Samuel at the age of 3? Or maybe it's prophetic of Samuel, because that was his whole life, wasn't it? Okay, that was set before. He was there forever before Yahweh, standing before the Lord's anointed, and he worshipped God there. Was that Samuel prophetically for the rest of his life? Or could it be that this is Elkanah, and it shows you the connection between Hannah, and I see a lot of people nodding, they might agree with that. I propose something else. Could it have been Eli? Who's been moved by this particular family. And I tend to, I'm not saying that I think that's Eli, I'm just saying if it is in that particular verse, brothers and sisters, think about it. It shows, again, what's our title, what's our main theme here? Is the influence on others for good. And I think there was a lot of good in Eli. And I think that here, Hannah and Elkanah, and then later on Samuel as he grew, touched that goodness. Sort of had an impact. And he saw the difference of what was going on. He saw the contrast between his own family and perhaps Elkanah, Hannah, and the family, particularly Samuel. He certainly grew to love this young boy, and he was a chip off the old block. And so what we've got here in all of this is a beautiful expression, haven't we? Okay? So to establish the point that I'm slowly building, and that is this influence, read verse 17 of chapter 1. Notice Eli's response. I think that's been drawn out of him by her. Go in peace. And the God of Israel grant thee thy petition that thou hast asked of him. Quite amazing, isn't it? And what was her response to that? Well, read verse 18 and you'll see that she accepted that as the words of God himself. She said, let thine handmaid find grace in thy sight, to Eli. So the woman went her way and did eat, and her countenance was no more sad. Now we might say in the modern sort of thing, the deed wasn't done yet. Okay? She wasn't expecting child. That happens in the next verse or two. But she took, when Eli said that, when the high priest said, go in peace, and may Yahweh grant you that petition, as far as Hannah was concerned, God had spoken directly to her heart, and she was going to give birth to the deliverer. That's she went away happy. And imagine Elkanah when she came back to him. He'd seen her go up like he'd seen her so many times in tears. And now she's come back almost like a skip with a smile on her face, and she sits down to eat with the family because God was going to bless her because Eli had said so. It's quite incredible, isn't it, that when as we then, go through this particular story, we see this ongoing contrast then. And perhaps the influence of Hannah and Elkanah and later Samuel developing here. So we read chapter 2 and verse 18, 19, we might as well read all the way through to 21. Starting at verse 18 of chapter 2, and I do apologise, I've been jumping around chapter 1 and 2 a bit, but I've been trying to build this particular point that I believe is in the record here. But Samuel ministered before Yahweh, being a child, girded with a linen ephod. That's a really unusual term, by the way, which I'm happy to talk to you about afterwards, because he was a child. And there's only one other record of someone who wasn't a priest dressed in a linen ephod, and that was David, when he danced before God, bringing the ark up. So, all right, let's keep reading. It says, moreover, his mother made him a little coat. Okay, and that's attached here. This is like part of the Levitical priestly sort of garb, and brought it to him from year to year, obviously a little bigger one each year, when she came up with her husband to offer the yearly sacrifice. And Eli blessed... I'll read that again. And Eli blessed Elkanah and his wife and said, Yahweh give thee seed of this woman for the loan which is lent to Yahweh. And they went unto their own home. And Yahweh visited Hannah so that she conceived and bare 3 sons and 2 daughters. I'm presuming that was over time and not, quintuplets. And the child Samuel grew before Yahweh. So what's being implied in those verses, brothers and sisters? There's a couple of things again being implied, is there not? First of all, that it would seem that after Hannah gave birth to Samuel, that she couldn't have children again. There must have been some time between that for it to be evident that it was no longer natural in that sense. And so once again, Eli has to come into the picture, doesn't he? So God here brings Eli back into this family's life, and he has to bless Elkanah and his wife. And I think this time it came with a great deal of understanding and a great deal of feeling. I'm sure he's entered into the feelings of this particular family at this time, because he knows in verse 20, doesn't he? He's very grateful from God's point of view. He's thinking about what God has done and what they have done, and therefore how God would feel about this. Were they a worthy couple to have more children? Well, look what they had done. They'd lived up to that oath. They'd brought this young boy Samuel. They were diligent and focused and God-loving people who respected the Lord's anointed, who came up and tried to make a difference within their ecclesia. And I'm sure Eli here goes, there can't be anybody in the whole nation more worthy than to have more children. And she gave birth to 5 more. But we leave tonight's study from verse 26, isn't it? And sorry, just before that, one point, I should read my notes, shouldn't I? Verse 22 to 25, we have Eli's rebuke. So hard on the end of that blessing that Eli just did for more children, for Elkanah and Hannah, hard on that is his rebuke to his boys. And I can't help but think that God has, through the Spirit, has deliberately put that in there. It's almost as if he now, because of their example, has to speak up to his sons. You might have a different thought about that. But they wouldn't listen, it says in end of verse 25, because Yahweh would slay them. In other words, it was the intention of God to bring judgment upon the house of Eli. Verse 26, in contrast, and the child Samuel grew on and was in favour both with Yahweh and also with men. We say, who does that remind you of? But notice it is both, isn't it? Because our walk and our worship, brothers and sisters and young people, in their ecclesial life, our walk is both to honour God, but it also is to be effective. Effective in the ecclesia. And that means a giving of ourselves, doesn't it? It means getting to know people. It's not just being hospitable, have them around for lunch, etc., but really getting to know each other. I mean, how can you have that conversation? We started the session with, how can we have that conversation with people unless we know them? But as an ecclesia, we need to do that. And we need to be effective. All right? And as far as I'm concerned, I'll now express that, and I see Justin sitting at the back there, I'm sure he'll agree with me, that the way, what we're doing right at this very moment, this is efficient. Okay? I've studied Samuel's life. I've come along to share with you some thoughts. Okay? It's not an effective way. The effective way is when you as an ecclesia, in mixing, talk, encourage, build each other up, okay? Get to know each other, speak up in love. Sometimes, the necessary words of changing people, suggesting certain things, but in many ways it's there more like God himself in forgiving, giving time. And if we did that, brothers and sisters, as brothers right across the world, then of course we would be honouring God, and we would be helping others on that journey.